Welcome to the last part of the three-part series, Developing Materials for the Acquisition of Language. Today, we will be discovering another competency which may sum up the other two. To begin with, we will be doing an activity first. I will be presenting to you a series of pictures, and I want you to decipher what word they are trying to say. First, if you say it's a shooting star, then you answered correctly. Next. If you say it's a banana split, you're correct. Next on the list, do I hear you saying breadwinner? Well, it's correct. Next, jogging pants. Yes, you get it right. Next, we have Facebook. Correct. Then, ballpen. Correct. Lastly, it's Ant-Man. Wow, you did good. Pictures paint 1,000 words indeed. They too have meaning to convey and interpretations to decipher. In communication, every word, phrase, and sentence we utter and write holds distinct meaning we want to communicate with to our audience. This is pragmatic competence. Today, we will discover how coursebook and pedagogies present and develop this competence. To begin with, we will also be doing a quick review on previous topics from previous chapters and the previous presentations made. Teacher Tom, an English teacher, wanted to know the effectiveness of his prepared materials in developing his students' communicative competence. He floated a survey answerable by a 1 to 5 scale. What process of materials development is he undertaking? If you say it's materials evaluation, then you are correct. The questionnaire he used was based on their department's team effort. They developed a universal then a local criteria after making a profile of his learners. Why are these criteria necessary? Well, these criteria are necessary as they are the beliefs that evaluators hold about how second or foreign languages are most effectively acquired. Thus, these criteria are necessary to say whether the course books are effective or not. Next. While doing so, he checked the content of their course book. He also looked for the objectives and activities present therein, and made another list of questions answerable by yes or no. What process is he doing? Well, indeed, it's materials analysis. Next, when his materials evaluation and analysis was over, he found out that certain activities in their course book were not contextualized, making it less valuable to his learners. With this, he made necessary changes to the activities his students specified in the survey. What process of materials development is this? Correct. It's materials adaptation. When they had a lesson on tag questions, he used a text-driven task-based approach coupled with discovery approach to present it. He had in mind Kolb's experiential learning. Why is this so? Well, as mentioned in other presentations, it is imperative for students to be indulged in various communicative settings in order for them to discover for themselves how language is used and applied. Thus, they should discover for themselves through text, through task, at the same time through experience. One day, he used a text to make his learners notice words they often encounter in other texts but used differently in the said text. He then asks his learners to deduce meaning of the said words out of the text. What can you say of his method? Well, akin to what we have said earlier, this is the process where students notice for themselves words, at the same time they deduce their own meaning, and thus making it more valuable for them. What about you? These are all necessary for our presentation this morning, developing materials for the acquisition of pragmatic competence. For this presentation, we will be having the following learning objectives and outcomes. First is to outline observations and materials for developing pragmatic competence. Next is to construct principles for developing materials in pragmatic competence. And to relate learner-centered pedagogical approach in developing materials for pragmatic competence. Fourth, to construct 10 universal criteria and 5 local criteria for evaluation of materials. And lastly, to adapt materials for the acquisition of language.
The last main competence is the pragmatic competence. To understand pragmatics, let us mention a very simple definition. It is the ability to use language in context. Rover 2005, but also Joule 2012 says that pragmatic is how we recognize what is meant even when it is not written. Thus, pragmatic goes beyond what the speaker can see. Trimerol 2001 expresses that it involves the knowledge that a learner has of the principles according to which the messages are organized, structured, and arranged, used to perform communicative functions, and sequenced according to interactional and transactional schemata. Besides this kind of messages, TRIM also provides the different competencies that integrate these pragmatic competencies. The first one is discourse competence. Here the speaker has to be able to produce a sequence of sentences in order to have coherent stretches of language, which are discursive units. In an illustrative scale that Trimerol 2001 presents about discourse competences, he describes a proficient user of the language in this area as someone that shows great flexibility reformulating ideas in different linguistic forms to give emphasis, to differentiate according to the situation, interlocutor, etc., and to eliminate ambiguity. In the discourse competence, the speaker is able to order sentences according to the topic, following a natural sequence, and has the ability of structuring a discourse in a logical way using coherence and cohesion, and put in practice the cooperative principle. In the thematic development, an English user has to be able to give elaborate descriptions and narratives, integrating sub-themes, developing particular points, and rounding off with an appropriate conclusion. Such thematic development is no more than knowing where and how to put a sentence, what word or connector to use, and how to close with a strong conclusion. A competent user of the discourse may be knowledgeable of text design, which can be understood as the ability to produce well-written pieces of writing, such as anecdotes, short stories, and also academic writings as journals, essays, and formal letters. Thus, text design conventions are also important elements to be a competent user of the written discourse. Functional competence. Trimerol 2001 states that it is concerned with the use of spoken discourse and written text in communication for particular functional purposes. This does not mean that the learners are just going to know the functions. They have to know how to interact by using them, making exchanges and leading to conclusions.
Created using Powtoon.
In the late 1970s and early 1980s, some course books focus on the following functions: agreeing, inviting, deciding, requesting, arranging, declining, and apologizing. They did so in the main by using a PPP approach in which exponents of the function were introduced in sentences or dialogues, practiced in drills, and then used by students in role plays. These exponents of language allowed students to perform role play at the same time to perform the said drills to achieve intended effects in various situations. However, these functions of language have become forms focus instead of form focus. Thus, course books return to the centrality of grammar. For this learning activity, you will be needing to make an outline of your observations on how coursebook and literature present and/or develop pragmatic competence. Then, write 5 principles on developing materials for the acquisition of pragmatic competence. I have made my own outline and this is what I will be sharing with you, though you may want to add or raise your questions in our group chat if you have one. Course books, for example, The Big Picture Upper Intermediate by Brewster and Lane in 2012 have the following features. Focus on teaching exponents of a featured function using the PPP approach, as mentioned earlier. And no text-rich section. Texts are necessary for text-driven approach at the same time for discovery approach where students discover the meaning of grammar, lexicon, and pragmatics. And then, no invitation for text creation for communication, neglecting the opportunities for engaging or applying whatever they have learned in actual communication. Course books have been lacking these two things. First, opportunities to achieve intended effects in actual communication provided, and attention to pragmatic strategies that involve achieving intended effects, for example, implying potential benefits for the interactant when trying to persuade them to do something that would benefit you. Yet, the ability to use and to counteract such strategies is vital for communicative success. Literature has pointed out the following issues in materials for developing pragmatic competence. First is the usage of conventional materials. Most course books still follow the PPP approach, and most activities are typically decontextualized, controlled, and guided practice exercises like fill in the gap, and the texts follow the advice of keep speakers polite and not confrontational or face-threatening, says by McCarthy and McCarten in 2010, thus perpetuating the image of the bland, safe, harmonious EFL world. Next to this is the uncontextualized speech acts. Learners are provided with out-of-context speech acts or the specific functions that people carry out in speaking and writing, such as apologizing, complaining, making requests, refusing things or invitations, complimenting, or thanking. Students were not provided with such an opportunity wherein they could apply these speech acts in a specific context. Next is in authentic interactive context. Genuine context that allows them to interact with one another or especially with native speakers are not necessarily authentic. The use of spoken corpora for the development of materials for the teaching of pragmatic routines is the focus of Bardovi Harlig and Mosman. They refer to research that indicates the value of interaction with conversation in the target language with both native speakers and other learners. Corpora, by the way, is the plural form of corpus, a collection of recorded utterances used as a basis for the descriptive analysis of a language. Thus, they develop these teaching pedagogy. First is to select corpus and identify necessary expressions. Then, we extract examples, prepare corpus excerpts for teaching, prepare noticing activities, and production activities. For example, open-ended noticing activity which gets students to really think about why an interactant in an authentic interaction used a particular pragmatic routine when ordering her food. They also made the following strong statements, to which Tomlinson and the rest of the authors agree to. Terms that contain the target expression should not be modified, but rather they should appear in the teaching materials exactly as they do in the corpus. It is not sufficient for learners to have a list of expressions. They must be contextualized. Again, context is made important. Among other benefits of production is for learners to notice the gap between what they want to say and what they can say, thus creating a need that can be responded to by the teacher. Lastly, Corpora provide two important resources for materials developer, namely frequency information and authentic language use that serves as input. With all those issues presented in the course book and pointed out by literature, it is thus necessary to look into these principles for developing materials in pragmatic competence. First is guided discovery. This places the teacher at the side of the students and not at the center of the stage, making them facilitators of learning. In relation with the learner-centered pedagogical approach, learners becomes the one to discover how language is used, how it is manipulated, and how words are used creatively to extract and do its intended effect. Next is the consideration of context as deemed necessary by various authors again and again, and noticing activities. It is imperative for students to be provided with experiences, texts, tasks, and opportunities where they would notice how language is used and applied. Again, the text-driven task-based approach is necessary too, because through text and task, students will be guided to notice how words are used in necessary context. And authentic interaction with conversation in target language is also necessary, as previously mentioned in one of our classes, that for students to achieve communicative competence, they must engage in authentic communication. Now, we are all set to do this final learning output. Having learned developing materials for the acquisition of language, pedagogical approaches, principles, and issues. You will be evaluating a unit or lesson in a book either on grammar, vocabulary, or pragmatics by writing 10 universal and 5 local criteria. Then, based on evaluation and your preferred pedagogical approach, maybe discovery approach, task-based, text-driven, make necessary adaptation of the material. Now that all of our objectives have been met, the outline of the observations on materials for developing pragmatic competence, the construction of principles for the acquisition of pragmatic competence, how all of these is related to the learner-centered pedagogical approach, and the evaluation and adaptation of materials. I would like to bring you to a verse in the Bible found in Jeremiah 29 verse 13. It says, "And you shall seek me and find me when you shall search for me with all your heart." When we seek God, we find Him especially if the heart is full of resolve to discover Him, akin to the discovery of language and meaning of new words or those beyond comprehension. It is only by searching with the intent of learning can one fully understand its meaning. So to sum up this presentation in this chapter, let me go back to some of the points that have been repeated all throughout. First, learner-centered pedagogy and activities. You may have noticed that most of the pedagogies and activities are focused on leading students at the center at the same time at the front of the learning situation in acquiring language. Why? It is because when they are the ones who discover for themselves the meaning, how language is conveyed, how language is used, and all its forms, then they will be able to acquire it and add the learning to their long-term memory. Second, it is important also to note the context of the learners in developing materials. In doing so, we do not put them in a context where they are not familiar with, thus producing an unproductive learning for them. Third is an opportunity for authentic interaction and communicative activities to be provided to students. EFL students need this for them to be able to apply what they have learned in the classroom in actual setting. The fourth point, text-driven, task-based plus discovery approach. As mentioned, these approaches are part of the learner-centered pedagogy. Thus, it is very important that we use effectively the text, the tasks, and coupled with discovery approach in order to make the learning of language more meaningful. Lastly, is the consideration of learners' needs, preferences, and learning goals. In doing so, we get to understand what our learners need, what our learners' contexts are, what language, formation, and form can we teach them as well as lead them to achieve. Thus, it is important to consider their needs, preferences, and learning goals. I guess and I hope that this chapter had been a great help to you in developing materials for the acquisition of language in grammar, lexicon, and pragmatics. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you will look forward to the next part of the presentations regarding developing materials for the development of skills. Thank you so much, and God bless you.